We're now here to discuss Suchitra Vijayan's book, Midnight's Borders, A People's History of Modern India. Thanks, Suchitra, for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your personal journey before the book, which you also describe in the book's prologue. You were a human rights lawyer in various parts of the world. So you could talk about a little bit about what that was like.
I actually started my career as working as a litigator for the War Crimes Tribunal of Yugoslavia and Rwanda. I just come out of law school, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I was all of 21, and a professor said, why don't you go spend some time at the tribunal? And that's what started it. The initial idea was that I would go spend about 6 months at the tribunal, come back to London, and then start, working at the law firm. But I didn't know that once I left London, then I would never be going back. And the 6 months in Hague then turned into another. So when I was at the tribunal, I was at the Milosevic's trial team, and then as soon as I joined, 4 months down the line, Milosevic died, and then from there I moved on to the tribunal in Rwanda. Just as I was finishing that up, a professor of mine was starting the resettlement legal aid project in Cairo. So Barbara Harrell Bond had already spent her life defending and working for refugees and refugee rights, and she was the founder of Amera. And now with the war in Iraq, it became imperative to provide legal aid for Iraqi refugees coming into countries like Egypt. So that took me to Egypt, where as Barbara left, I built the Resettlement Legal Aid Project, where we gave legal aid for Iraqi refugees for close to. I was there for almost 2 years, but the organization still continues to do the work. And then I came from there, and I moved. I came to Yale for grad school, where I started working on counterinsurgency practices in Afghanistan-Pakistan border, which then led me to the initial ideas of the book. And 10 years down the line, here we are having this conversation.
Right. So at what point, like, how did the human rights work blend into the idea for this book? Like, if you could talk about that a little bit.
I think it was less about human rights and more about frustrations of a young lawyer. I wanted to become a lawyer, at least as a young person, I wanted to become a lawyer because I believed that law could find solutions for the social crisis in our social worlds. And very quickly you realize that that is not the case. And sometimes a lot of the frustration came with a deep sense of failure as both as an individual and also within the systems that we work with, that often justice and legality are not the same. Often the process itself does not mean that one has tried to understand what these questions of freedom, justice, and dignity means. Alongside, I've always been a photographer and a writer. I'm an autodidact, which means that while I've never trained as a writer or photographer, these were things that I've always used as a way not only to document the various social worlds that I was inhabiting at various points in time, but also a way for me to work out my own conflicts, my own concerns, my angst, if one might call it. And that continued from when I was, I think, 15 all the way till my grad school years. And often I found that perhaps one had to find more innovative ways of thinking and writing and challenging it. And that's how I think this kind of came about. As a lawyer, you learn the skills of analysis, the capacity to read copious amounts of texts, compress complexity and understand that, which does come into help. But also it gives you a sense of how systems and processes work. But that itself does not give you solutions to many of the things that we deal with. And I think in some ways, my writing or my photography or whatever public engagement one does in various capacities, even as a lawyer, I think all comes from that sense of trying to, one, make sense of the world, but second, also are there ways for us to find solutions to many of the problems that confront us.
Why borders? What in particular is it about borders that became so attractive?
I think I don't know. This question has been asked of me many times, and every time I think about this, I feel like I turn into this rambling. It becomes a rambling Socratic discourse. I think one because I think we think of the bordered areas as something that is so foreign and alien. In reality, it is not. Many of these conflicts, either when I worked as a lawyer, whether it was the war in Iraq, being in Afghanistan, having lost friends, having friends who actually continue to be refugees, political exiles. My own clients, some of them were political prisoners, but also people who had to flee um, war and conflict. One realizes that borders is not something that is external, it is something that affects our everyday reality. With the NRC and CAA, it affects the everyday realities of you and me. So, in that sense, I think the bordered existence, nation state, citizenship, the very fact of what gives us rights all come from this idea of what holds us, what citizenship is given to us, and what rights the citizenship can offer to us. And I think that's the first part of it. Um, I also went to Afghanistan not with the idea that I wanted to write about a border. I went to Afghanistan trying to make sense of the post 9/11 world. Why is it that the world's largest territorial army um, in Afghanistan, after $13 trillion, at least when I was in Afghanistan in 2010, that was the amount, the dollar figure that had been spent in Afghanistan till date. I'm sure that money is now doubled. Um, was unable to understand this people's resistance or conflict. You had the coin manual with people talking about insurgency, but that was the question that I went with. I didn't go there with the question of understanding the borders. But once you reach these spaces, you understand that somehow the questions you go there with sometimes are not the questions that one asks. Your questions become vacuous. What you're seeing is completely different. And at that point in time, I started traveling across the Afghanistan Pakistan border. And I think that kind of gave me other ideas, arguments. And the idea was, what would I find? Also, I was much younger. I was in my 20s. I was perhaps far more idealistic, far more brave, far more, um, how does one put it? Perhaps far more cavalier in terms of, the courage that comes with saying, yes, let's just go try it out. And that was the initial kernel of an idea. What would I find if I did the same thing with India? What would I find if I traveled? It started with a place of not knowing. And I think that's how the project and the ideas came together.
Your book is subtitled The People's History of Modern India, but what I was surprised by was that it actually starts with the Pakistan Afghanistan border, which to me was an unusual choice. So, I mean, why was that?
I think one part of it is that um, the idea of India, or the phrase that's often used and abused and misused, is that what is this idea? What does India first? What encompasses it? Um, One of the first interviews that I did in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, especially with Afghans who were 80 years then, their racial memory of a border was not with Pakistan. Their racial memory of a frontier was not even with India as we understand now. It was Hindustan. It was an contiguous borderland in which people, ideas, conflicts, ammunitions, everything moved.
Hmm.
And that was a very fascinating moment for me because even if you just went back a few years, how people imagined spaces and borders and walls was very different. Nobody imagined or even could envision the kind of militarized, fragmented nation states of today. And in some ways, in Paktika province, many of the women there actually were brides who were bought to Paktika province from Hyderabad. I mean, Hyderabad in India, not Hyderabad in Pakistan.
Right.
Hyderabad or UP, or in reality, the relationships, the conversations, the migration patterns were far more complex. You had stories of people traveling all the way um, from Kunduz to Calcutta. You'll have stories of people from Paktika province traveling all the way up north into the Kashmir Valley. You will have stories of people again. That sense of migration, the racial memory of a border, a frontier was very different. And I think you cannot divorce these people and their histories with our understanding that this was a larger conversation that one was having, that you cannot divorce the conversation. I mean, of course, the war. Another interesting thing, of course, is that while the Afghanistan-Pakistan border and the war on terror is now being essentially called AFPAC, it can't just be AFPAC. It has to be Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kashmir, and India because there's a longer cultural, historical, political memory to it.
Right. Um, I just want to go through the journeys in the book, like one by one. So from there, you move on to the India-Bangladesh border, and I'd like to ask you. I mean, one, how did you plan the contours of this journey? Because it seems incredibly complicated and incredibly arduous to me. And the second question I have is that if you could give us a sense as we talk about your various journeys, what were the differences among with these various borderlands, like for you as a traveler?
The preparation was really hard in the sense that when I first started, I spent about 6 months just planning and reading. The planning included one, it started with the political local histories of this region. Um, I kept a log bibliography, I mapped the regions, I tried sourcing archival material, I looked at how maps were drawn. Also, it's impossible to actually get an actual local detailed map for various other security reasons. And it was also easy to trace the India-Bangla border because of the still the predominantly porous nature of it. Also, the fact that the line actually runs through people's houses, farms, rivers, lakes. It was much easier just to kind of trace, kind of figure out. That kind of stopped once, of course, that stops in Kashmir. But also in a lot of these places, it wasn't just about traveling, it's also about returning to some of these places. In some of these places, I do go and return. The only place that I didn't return was the Arunachal Pradesh. It's also the place that I spent the least amount of time. And I think that like you'll see that in the chapter as well. But the moment you come to Kashmir, you cannot trace the border because the very nature of the landscape of Kashmir, the curfews, the checkpoints, the mobility, the surveillance, which again I talk about the book, is that Srinagar was my base, and from Srinagar I would go to a point A, return, point B, return, stay in houses of friends and those you trust. You had to build a kind of relationship of trust. Also, I was an Indian traveling, and given the precarious nature of how things have played out since December, since 2010, and how the nature of things changed in the valley, which also meant that you were constantly negotiating your place within that. Of course, the India-Pakistan border is one of the most militarized borders in the world. You can't even go near that, which meant that you need to get permission. So that was one part of it. So planning was often a huge part of that. In terms of the border regions itself, it's not just the border. This is true of India anywhere. This is true of the subcontinent anywhere. The world changes every 100 feet, right? And that's the nature of it. That's why it's also so incredibly difficult to write anything comprehensive or to claim that you've written the book or one book. Stories change, people's lived experiences change, and that was true of Afghanistan as well. You would travel from one village to another village, same kinship, same tribal affiliations, but then the way they organized themselves was so completely different. In that sense, I think what one then tries to understand is be truthful to the social realities that one is witnessing, and then kind of try and articulate it with as much clarity, truth, objectivity, and dignity of the people that you're speaking with as possible.
In the Bangladesh section, I was struck by the very incredibly moving story about the girl who's shot while she's trying to mount the barbed wire. So tell us more about that experience, like being in that zone, and which has now become very politically potent with the NRC and the CA. So what was that like?
Um, so first, let's kind of come back, is that I'm always surprised that those most often have been victims of violence, judicial violence, political violence, real perceived violences, everyday bureaucratic violence. People whose entire lives have been completely remade and broken sometimes. who still have the immense clarity and courage, and also the generosity to sit with you and tell you their stories. No one has the right to demand of another person that they tell them your stories. I know that often as writers and journalists, it's very easy to talk about bearing witness as if you're doing something great. No, bearing witness is actually very easy. What is hard is to actually tell your story. So that itself was something I still don't understand. I don't understand why any of these people ever wanted to speak to me. Why should they? So when someone gives you their time, when someone invests in that time, the political time, then you have an absolute responsibility to not only represent it in a way that they want it to be represented, but you also have to represent it with as much dignity and courage, and more importantly, with an understanding that it just cannot be the story. The story has to have a larger structural implication. Often you will see stories of lynching and say, oh my God, this happened and that happened. And then we stop. We we fetishize and we make this into a spectacle, but we really don't hold the larger structures, systematic structures, the people who are responsible for it. We don't do ethnographies of the powerful, we do ethnographies of the powerless. So that was one part of it. How does it feel? And I think I write about this in the chapter on Assam, where I say that towards the end, I felt like I was the chronographer of other people's violence and pain. And I didn't want this to be that. I didn't want this to be a fact where I was just going and collecting other people's pain and misery. So that was the second part of it. In Felani's case, it was the most publicized case, but she's not the only person to have faced this. And what one has to understand is that there is a large body of work that has systematically documented. And that's when local grassroots organizations, human rights defenders, organizations that consistently track and report these things become so important. And I think the Human Rights Watch called it one of the most deadliest borders. We think of the Afghanistan, we think of the India-Pakistan border as a deadly border, but in reality, all borders endanger a certain kind of violence, especially for those who inhabit these spaces. So in that sense, it's never easy when you sit and encounter these stories. One could only hope that one walks away by doing something in terms of representation, in terms of creating an archive and creating a footnote that can later be used, if at all can be used for us to understand what was happening in these spaces.
As I was going along further in your book, I realized that a lot of the things I was reading about now in the last year or so have become incredibly current. Like you move on to the India-Myanmar border, you talk about the Bangalore and Kohima, um, and you were apprehended by the Burmese border police there, which you write about very movingly. Um, so if you could talk about a little bit about that experience and also how you see the current crisis, for example, because that's very much about borders and the kind of violence that borders engender. Uh, so, like, what is the sort of difference, or have your observations been um, verified, or what you saw at that time and what's happening now? I mean, if you talk about some of those connections.
Um, I try not to, and I've said this before. I try not to make this about me because it's very easy for all of us to become Indiana Jones. It's very easy for all of us to make it about us. Um, so what I really wanted to do in this book was to, and it's very difficult when you're a you're a brown woman who looks a certain way and you're traveling these spaces. It's very easy for everyone to demand that you talk about yourself. How does it feel? And I think hopefully um, I try not to do that because I think it's less about me and it's more about the people in these spaces. But what I do want to talk about is that we forget how porous these borders are. While it is fenced, it's partly fenced, partly porous. And just as I was found on the other side, it's very easy. And this is not just me. I write about this in the book as well. is that even the men who guard these borders often find themselves on the other side. If it's a foggy, there are multiple instances where the Indian Border Security Force finds themselves on the other side, and then to be caught and returned back. And similarly, this happens, which means that it shows not only the porous nature of it, often that the lines we draw have very different reflections on the ground. So that's the first part of it. Second is that these stories have a longer historical continuum. Rohingyas and other refugee communities it's not just the Rohingyas. There are multiple ethnic groups from the Myanmar borderlands that have come into India over the last few years as refugees. This is true of Mizoram, this is true of Nagaland, this is true of all of these bordered states that have a border. And what you really have to understand is that a violent authoritarian regimes often produce refugee crises. And often what one forgets is that even the war, the Bangladesh Liberation War, one of the reasons the then Indira Gandhi government gave for going into East Pakistan, was the fact that this regime was producing refugees, and India, as a secular democratic republic, actually had a moral responsibility to protect those. I mean, it's quite, if you go back and look at those, the newspaper archives from the time, it's quite appalling in terms of the language that we used back then to the language that one uses today, in which today in Manipur, border refugees coming in or asylum seekers coming in have been pushed back into the border. So this is an ongoing crisis, and all nations produce refugees, right? All nation states produce refugees, and all nation states also take in refugees. And I think we need to kind of understand that and have a broader discussion about that. And the second thing is that the UN Charter says that every person has a right to a state, Yet, and it's very important because it comes from the Second World War's understanding of the fact that uh, it's very easy to render someone stateless. It's very easy to deprive people of their rights. And I think those are the frameworks that one should think about, not talk about the ideas of illegality, legality, because no human is illegal, right? Often people flee for a very specific reason, and these are protected categories of why people flee. And we really need to now understand within these frameworks of law, within these frameworks of protections, what can we do to protect those fleeing violence, and not confuse this with the idea of national security? Because one of the reasons that being given is that we need to stop these refugee flows because this could become a national security issue. For us to untangle these various streams, but rather think about ways for us to protect communities that are most affected by regimes that use violence and use violence very indiscriminately.
Indians are incredibly ignorant about Burma. So, could you talk about what the nature of the present crisis is after the military crackdown?
Burma has been an authoritarian regime for a very long time. In between, there was a small opening where Aung San Suu Kyi was released, and it was seen as a moment where perhaps there could be a bridge between an authoritarian regime, a military dictatorship, and opening up of democratic processes. So you have two issues. One, a military regime that has had absolute control over state institutions. Second, the same, which means that when you look at military regimes or any authoritarian regimes, these are equal opportunity oppressors. And I think that is one thing one has to understand. They will oppress anyone and everyone who is seen as even a possible threat to the regime. Again, this has been extensively documented through various reports since the early 60s. So there is material, documented evidentiary material going back at least to the 1960s. So that is one part of it. Second, the persecution of various minority groups considered to be not Burmese. And I think that's what the Rohingya crisis starts, is that you have a series of citizenship laws, not very unlike the NRC-CAA, being put into place that then say that, which starts again with very similar provisions where people are required to show proof of citizenship. And the proof of citizenship actually goes back a few hundred years, where the moment the British occupation of Burma starts. So you're giving these arbitrary dates as providing documents saying that if you could prove that you were in this part of the world and you existed in this world on the day of the British occupation, then you are a citizen, right? So it's very difficult for someone to bring proof of land and affiliation, say, which is 100 years back. For example, a parallel example would be that, for instance, my father doesn't have a birth certificate. I don't know if my grandfather ever had one. As someone who comes from a landowning caste in India, technically we should have far more documentation. Yet, even if the more privileged landowning castes of South India, my father belonging to one of them, doesn't have proof of his birth certificate, has no proof of land, it's going to be very hard, say, for someone who comes from these backgrounds to prove. So that's what the government starts. Second, they start by creating various kinds of ID cards for various citizenships, depriving the Rohingya community of any kind of proof that they actually belong or reside here. The ID cards themselves will have a name but will not say place of birth. So this process of manufacturing citizens into stateless subjects started much long ago. That occupation of land, indiscriminate use of violence, rape, destruction of graveyards, destruction of mosques, tax for everything from a roof tax to a tax to get a marriage certificate. This consistent persecution of over a long period of time has created many refugee flows. So this is not the first time you have refugees coming in, and it's not just the Rohingya communities. And now with the crackdown, you will see another round, another flow of refugees coming in because, as we've noticed and we've heard, the state has been indiscriminately killing. News report says that 81 people were shot dead in protests. So what you really, again, as I said, is that a violent regime will produce refugee flows. All states, by the way, India produces refugees as well. The largest number of refugees coming into the US-Mexico border in the last year was actually Indians who flew from India to Central American states and made their way all the way up. And that number rose by, I think, 200%. So all states produce refugees.
Oh, wow, I had no idea. Although I've seen this one Malayalam film with Dulquer Salman, which has a similar theme. It's called CIA, and he goes
Oh,
to
yeah. He crosses for a girl that he's in love with, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I thought it was very improbable, but I'm shocked to hear that it's actually a big trend of Indians going to Central America and then trying to cross. Um, Next, in your book, you move on to Assam, which again is interesting in terms of what you're just saying, that how the violence of borders actually then produces violence not just outside, but even inside those borders. So, would you like to talk a little bit about that in the context of Assam and especially the NRC?
The NRC is so I was there in Assam just before the you had a news cycle of NRC and CAA starting about, I think, 2.5, 3 years ago, and I was there just before that. And one has to view the NRC and CAA again, all of this within a larger historical context. So long before you had the CAA NRC, you had the Foreigners Tribunal, which was again, excuse me, an ad hoc tribunal that had no procedural oversight. There was already, again, manufacturing and creating a group of people who were deprived of citizenship. Second, of course, was the ongoing violence. So if you're thinking about Assam, I would think about it in three different ways. One, of course, is the institutional and judicial bureaucratic violence that was put into place through various means, through the foreigner tribunals and others. Second, you have a system in which you had the border security force and others were given absolute control over what can be done in these regions. Third is an ongoing acts of various violence that has been inflicted on various communities. Some of them are massacres that were covered and widely known, others not so much. On top of all of this, you also see the region in which there's a constant environmental and ecological crisis. So people often migrate. Even in the book, if you look at it, people will tell you that often most people that I met, especially those who come from landless communities, both Hindus and Muslims and other communities, other tribal communities, or other indigenous communities, all of them will tell you that they've moved at least twice or thrice, and often they've moved, one because of violence, second because of ecological, the environmental destruction, the flooding. The land becomes flooded often. So what you really, and of course, there's also ongoing violence between I don't want this to reduce this to communal violence. I think the violence on the ground is far more complicated, and that violence again gets replicated as in the book someone says small massacres and little riots that nobody talks about, and that happens as well, which means that so you have all of this compounding. So imagine if someone is forced to migrate and leave their home not once but thrice. There are instances, one because there's no livelihood, second because there's a flood, third because there is a riot, there's a massacre, you go to an internally displaced camp. What documentation of your identity will you have? There was this moment that doesn't appear in the book where we go in to this village, and there is this man who's literally holding his papers and trying to dry them because something fell into the river, and that was the last of his documents. If that document is gone, wet, um, it is not there. And he was like, I'm going to dry this and I'm then going to try and laminate this so that it's protected, right? So that's how precarious lives were. And this moment of constantly trying to find citations and notes for your lived experiences. So I think we have to view that within that longer anxiety, crisis, and this constant need to prove your identity or your citizenship or where you belong. Second, what you were seeing was a sense of a deep fear that all of this could be easily weaponized against you. And I think that was what was already playing out. And with the NRC and CAA together, I think what you've really seen is a deep sense of not only crisis, but also fear. And I think those are the kind of threads I think we really need to understand and explore.
What do you see as the future of the NRC? Because I mean, I wrote recently in an essay that I think that the protests, for now at least, have killed the CNRC project. But in the recent campaign, you have now talks of a corrected NRC or NRC to be redone. For the outsider, even as for a journalist like me, it's a baffling maze because it seems for once that the central government is now reluctant to go ahead with the NRC, but the Assamese still want it. So where do you see the NRC today, and what do you see as the future of the NRC, not just in Assam, but like all over the country?
See, a national register of citizens in a country like India is always going to be political, it's going to be fraught, and it can easily be weaponized for so many other things. And we can't see these issues in a silo. We have to see these in relationship to the National Population Register. We have to see this in the ongoing need to link everything to Aadhaar. And then that data then being sold off. India made a deal with the Israeli government where our data is already being sold off for a certain value. You have technocrats constantly hawking and willing to sell our privacy in the name of bureaucratic efficiency. So all of this is connected and linked. So overarching theme that connects all of this is the quiet dismantling of the rights-bearing citizen into a consuming subject. We are all fine as long as we are consuming subjects who can be surveilled, our data can be mined, we can be used either as an underclass of citizens for the global workforce. All of that is fine. But the moment we start demanding the rights already given to us within the constitutional framework, then we become seditious. The moment we start questioning something, for example, a journalist traveling to Hathras to trying to document a case of rape can be picked up and kept. So one should always look at all of this within the larger framework of what's happening. And one could easily say this is only India, this is not India, this is happening across, this is happening in Bangladesh, it's happening in Pakistan, it's happening in Nepal, it's happening in Sri Lanka, it's happening in the United States, it's happening globally. The figure of the rights bearing citizen is being completely dismantled. Now, what is going to happen with something like the NRC? Um, if I was not mistaken, I saw a newspaper item a month ago where I was told that already in Old Town in Hyderabad, people are walking in and trying to figure out who lives where. My fear is that the NRC project would become, just as in Burma, a bureaucratic coordinate search, that the NRC and the National Population Register projects will become a bureaucratic coordinate search, especially for minority communities or communities that are oppressed within a locality. Because in India, oppression works like a multiple matrix, and often history and memory are local. So often, how communities work and interact, what communities are powerful, what communities are oppressed will change. But I'm looking at communities that are already um, oppressed, or communities already are struggling to get the rights, will again perhaps be put into some kind of a bureaucratic coordinate search when they do this whole exercise. Second, I think, is that given the way the central government has pushed through not only this, but various other laws very quickly, I think we need to come up with a better way to resist this, right? It has to be a multi-pronged. It cannot just be elections. It has to be elections. It has to be protests. It has to be consensus building. All of this has to work together. At this point in time, I don't know. I feel like this is going to come back. It's not gone away. It's going to come back, and it's going to be, in my opinion, it's going to stay for a long time, and I think it's going to have more casualties. In the book, there is this chapter where there's this place where I tried and put in a list of all the people who had died. It's called Death by Citizenship.
Mm. Yeah,
This
I
was
saw.
this was just the number of people that we could find or document with citations and sources till the moment the book went to print. I think we're going to have a lot of deaths by citizenships, and I think it's going to be painful, and it's not going to be easy.
That's terrifying. And one of the things that it struck me while I was reading a book is how the violence of the borderlands is, I mean, it's actually coming more and more to the center. And Pratap Bhanu Mehta's famous phrase, the Kashmirization of India, is what really we're saying, and which obviously brings me to Kashmir. And what interested me about Kashmir is that it's a borderland, but it's also a decades-long conflict. So how was that different from something like a India Bangladesh or India Myanmar, which might be a sort of low-intensity conflict, but in Kashmir it's a totally different dimension. So how was that like?
Right. I'm actually kind of going to go back and um, critique Mehta's thing of Kashmirization of India. I that op-ed um, is right in its content, as in the ongoing violence, the assault. But I would be very wary of calling it the Kashmirization of India for two reasons. One, many Kashmiris and scholars, um, this is not Kashmirization of India. For them, India has never been a democracy, right? From their view, the revolutionary constitution that Ambedkar gave us, which granted 300 million subjects of colonial rule equal citizenship, was also the constitution that was used to implement laws like ASFA and PSA. And that is true of, if you talk to many Manipuri scholars, if you talk to scholars from Nagaland, Dolly Kikon has written about it. The revolutionary constitution of India was only revolutionary for a handful of us. For vast majority of these regions, this constitution was never revolutionary. It was actually the same constitution that was used to very specifically deprive them of fundamental rights. I mean, I hope nobody argues now at this day and age that ASFA or PSA are necessities. Of course, we also have the case of Punjab, where the right to life was actually suspended for the longest of time. I was actually surprised to find that. So I think it's not so much as Kashmirization of India. This is something else. And in case of Kashmir, I think two things. I think one, for a lot of Kashmiris, this is a matter of life and death. It's a matter of freedom and it's a matter of death. It's not a freedom and oppression, it's a matter of freedom and death. And often what is lost in all of this is that, and something that most Kashmiris will say, is that the Kashmir conflict is often seen as a geopolitical gamble or a gain or a fight between two nation states of India and Pakistan. And now often Kashmiris themselves have been rendered voiceless. And the rendering of voicelessness became even more apparent in after Article 370, when 8 million Kashmiris were violently silenced. Now, the violence in Kashmir is a very specific kind of occupational violence. And that violence is now, yes, of course, a certain kind of violence is now coming to India. But one thing we have to understand, and I try and make this point as nuanced and as calmly as possible, is that I don't know where you grew up, but I grew up in Madras. I didn't grow up under checkpoints or curfews. Um, while now, of course, when the Sterlite incident happened, you saw a sharpshooter trying to aim at the citizens. Yes, these are parallels that are very shocking, but I think we also, while we understand the parallels, we should try and not call them similar. And I think we have to fundamentally understand and critique that this violence is spreading in India and will continue to spread in India, not because the borderlands are coming inside, it's because we are creating trenches within the nation, the body politic of the nation state. And the way in which the violence played out in, say, Kashmir, Manipur, Mizoram, in parts of Pakistan, in parts of Punjab, while can be drawn as parallel, are not similar. You're going to find a very different kind of violence playing out in India. The lynchings that happen, for example, is very different than the custodial deaths that happen in some place. The ongoing right for freedom, corporatization, and the violence that comes out of protests against corporatization is not the same as pro-democracy protests that happens elsewhere. So while we are trying to make this, I think the larger point is we always have to stand in solidarity with those fighting for freedom and dignity, but also make a very clear distinctions in terms of who they are fighting and what are the structural forces in place.
Well, I personally find some merit in the Pratap Bahadur method description, primarily because while it may not operate at the same intensity, I mean, what you see in Kashmir as a military occupation, but the fact that elements of that playbook are being borrowed and being played out, I think is a useful framework to think about, although obviously it's not the same growing up in mainland India. I mean, I grew up in Delhi and Kashmir, where I've been a couple of times. So I don't think there's any comparison. But the fact that the playbook of the borderlands, the violence of the borderlands, is now being used to suppress the population in the mainland, which has largely been sort of sheltered from that intensity of violence, is something I find interesting in that phrase. I want to move to the next and the final section of your book, which is the India and Pakistan. And many years ago, I went to the evening ceremony when I went on a trip to Amritsar, where you have that sort of puerile but also very scary sort of downing of the flags, where the guards are sort of this hostility that they project. And I got reminded of that while reading your sections, because it seems utterly puerile and paranoid at the same time. And tell us a little bit about what that was like. I mean, going in Rajasthan, I mean, these places that nobody's really ever heard of, and being in Punjab and going around those borders. And how was that different from the rest of the, because in India's imagination, it's the India-Pakistan border that really sort of,
Right.
salient.
No, sure. I just quickly want to respond to the playbook idea. I think you're right. The playbook is being used. So there's no second. Of course, understand that authoritarian regimes that use violence learn from each other. And they learn from each other very, very well. I think it's the democracy, it is the grassroots movements that sometimes I think really struggle to kind of kind of draw those parallels. So yes, the playbook is being used. So in that sense, yes, I do agree with you on that. Now, in terms of the India-Pakistan border, is that it's the same thing. It's what you really see. I think we are all very much affected by the visual representations of the social world that is brought to us. So, what is the visual representation of the India-Pakistan border that we understand? I was very young when the film Roja came out, which was A.R. Rahman's, breakout movie. That was my first encounter of it. I didn't know, I think I must have been 10 or something when the movie came out. Um, that was the first time I was encountering Kashmir. And I think that film is a very good example of how we think about these bordered spaces, India, Pakistan, um, all this beauty, and the villains are all Muslims, they're all busy.
Right.
Second is movies like The Border, movies like where I think there was a movie that had Hrithik Roshan on Kargil as well, which or of course, as a young person, I remember I think NDTV had just started becoming very famous, and Kargil war was happening, and I'd just come back from school, and my mom said, "Look, for the first time I was seeing Barka Dat on the street." She said, "Look, Barka is so, she's so courageous. She's, uh, but the problem with is that this is as young people, this is what I grew up with. One, a nationalistic representation which always made us look better than someone else and completely depriving the other person of humanity. Second, even the great reporters and journalists that we venerated then came back and said, what about the human rights of soldiers? And completely erasing the lived examples of it. In the sense that everything has now become, so that is what you listen about, or you talk about this moment where Rajasthan is empty, Punjab has these mustard fields and they send their sons off to war. When you travel, you realize the story is far more complicated. Operation Parikram fundamentally remade these border villages where aggressive military presence meant that people lost their livelihoods. The nuclear testing, that story didn't make it to the book. But I do want to flag, I think Neha Dikshit did another long she returned to the villages in Pokhran and then kind of looked at what happened, the actual aftermath of what it means of the detonations. Then you see stories of communities that have, especially communities that were nomadic, that once traversed these lands whose entire livelihoods have now shrunk, because you could no longer travel from Rajasthan into all the way up to Sindh. Those migratory routes have been completely destroyed. Um, of course, with all of this comes a deep, what we don't forget is that militarization is also ecologically unsafe. The concertina wires that then come down are also an ecological problem. Um, the stories in Gujarat, again, some of the Gujarat never made it into the book for other reasons. Again, the stories of fishermen who are caught, what you really see in all of this is a deep sense. Again, these are communities that are already deprived because of structural reasons. So what you're really seeing is not the magnificence of a border that we've erected that you can see from the sky. What you're really seeing is everyday people whose life and reality, and I keep using the word dignity over and over again because that's important, right? The word dignity somehow seems to have lost all its meaning in our current dispensation. Um, and I think that is what is being deprived. And we tend to see these as aggressive, that somehow we define ourselves by who we see as our enemy, rather than defining ourselves by the values that we should hold together. So those were some of the things that I felt needed to be highlighted.
How is the India-Pakistan border of your imagination via Roja and all the other nationalism that was sort of injected into into you or any other normal Indian? middle class person, different from the India-Pakistan border that you saw. Like, you described some of the sections in Rajasthan when you're talking to the guards. So, what was really the difference of actually being there and the border that you had sort of, that has been part of your imagination since childhood?
Um, One, it's very different from the Bangladesh border because Bangladesh border is porous. You have 200 million people living on both sides. The India-Pakistan border, on the other hand, is mostly just cleansed of people, right? It's usually there are maybe the closest village would be 10 or 15 miles away. So here you literally just cleanse the space. It's a very so visually it's very different. Second, it's a lot of waiting. After you've seen border fences for 10 years, you go see another border fence and you're like, fine, it reminds me of the border fence I saw 10 miles. Um, so in that sense, I think there is no ongoing conflict. There is no, and in the book, as one of the person says, a lot of soldiering is just waiting around. And what I found really funny was one of the border security guards has never seen a porcupine and he wants to put the helmet on top of a porcupine. That was his mission. His mission was not to guard this border. His mission was to while away time, and he was trying to place an old helmet on top of a porcupine and take photographs. And I think those were the more lighter moments of the book where you realize how absurd, because every time in India now it's become so fashionable to say things like, oh, look, the soldiers are in the border guarding us. But what do you give them? Apart from the porcupine story, you also realize that these are men often, this is where the caste and class aspect comes in, and which we never speak about, is these are men who often come from communities that are already impoverished. Their allowances are never enough. They are not given the right gear to do the work. Often they are left with very little at the end of it. So what you're really seeing is also these complicated stories, these personal portraits of people who goes to do this job. It's not nationalism, it's not patriotism, it's something else also that's at play.
No, the porcupine story was really funny. It just brought home how awfully boring at times these very glamorized sort of defending the border, defending the country type of sort of mythologies are. I just want to come to a couple of closing questions. One, I want to ask you, the photographs in the book are stunning. So what was the reason for putting the photographs in there? I mean, what was the broader sort of thematic or philosophical or intellectual reasons for having the photographs along with the text and without captions as well? Because that made it less, I mean, captions would have made it more newsy. And I think, I'm guessing there's a conscious reason for not having the captions there. So what was that?
One, this book actually started as a photographic project. I initially wanted this to be some kind of a scrapbook in which it would be. Now, if I go back and look at the initial ideas, it looks very stupid and very, very vacuous. So, I mean, I think one also has to acknowledge one's own um, shallowness, if one might. Because back then, what I really wanted to do was make a scrapbook, which would be images, it would be text, it would be maps, kind of letting people go in and kind of make things for themselves. And then about I think a year in, I realized that that was not, that was actually giving excuses, that was, and I'll always remember this. A professor of mine once, I wrote this essay. I remember I was in my second year of law school. It was a jurisprudence class. I wrote an essay that I thought was so stellar. Um, I was like, this is just, I'm just going to blow the socks off. And I actually got a B minus for it. And I was um, so broken. And I went back to my professor and I said, what is this? This is such, which second year law student would refer all of this, in that sense, this sense. And, he said, look, the point is not that you're not smart. Of course, you can quote everyone from Kant to, you can talk about the Radbruch formula. That's not the problem. My problem is that you didn't take a side. You didn't take a side. What was your legal argument? You've made a jurisprudential argument, but end of the day, you're demonstrating to me that you are brilliant You're telling me that you can cite sources, you can understand complex philosophical legal problems. How is it relevant to me if you haven't taken a side? And I think that's what I was doing with the initial version of the book. I wasn't taking a side. And the moment I started writing this book was also the moment when a lot of things changed. The world changed in some ways. And my job as a writer was to take a position. I couldn't do that just with images. Images were a big part of it. And so the text changed, the book changed, the heavy theoretical versions of the book changed. The book has no theory. The book has no great proclamations. The language had to be light. I was not writing for someone who had an Oxbridge, Cambridge, Ivy League education. I was not writing to impress someone who was like me. I was writing for my people. I was writing literally for the person on the street. If he picked up the book somewhere in the middle, had 2 minutes to read, I wanted them to read something where they felt, I wanted them to see something. If I felt angry, I wanted them to feel angry. If I saw moments of love, I wanted them to see that moment of love. If I felt a little bit of chuckle in the middle of all of this, I wanted them to do that. And in that way, writing this book changed. And I rewrote this book so many times, and it's still not perfect, but that's so. And I didn't want to capture, and I think a lot of photographers, even today, I recently saw a photographic body of work on Maoist insurgency in India. It had a very weird name. It had quoted Walter Benjamin and critical theorists. And my first response was, it's the same thing, right? Yes, you're brilliant. You can read Walter Benjamin, but you are writing about a region that has gone through so much violence. You're talking about people who have to constantly mortgage their lived experience and dignity to just make it to the next day. Why are you losing language? That what has Walter Benjamin have to do with Jharkhand, right? That was very important for me. And it was my own, I also had to unlearn all of these prejudices, right? Because when you go to all of these institutions, they teach you to write a certain way, they teach you to speak a certain way. So my job was not to impress anyone that I knew all of this. So that's how the text came together. We took photographs. There was this one beautiful, stunning photograph of this woman that we had to take away because it became unsafe to put her name. Because in this case, we had her name, her village, her photograph. So the photograph had to go. That's what we did. And we didn't want to put captions because the images are part of, you read the image and the text together. They're all footnoted. The book has a large bibliography and everything is footnoted. But the image is a reflection of the text, it's the story. And that's what we try to do. And I should thank both my editors, both my US editor, Ryan, and India editor, Ajita, who both truly came on board to kind of help me think through that. And that's what I did with the images, is that it's not enough that the images are stunning. I don't have to prove anyone that I understand black and white images and I can do. It was important for me that I was writing for my people. I was writing as a response to this political moment. And that's what I wanted to do. And I think that's why the scrapbook went away, the language went away, and the photographs now exist as they are. And there again, I have another 400 photographs that I've not needed for the same reason. They're beautiful, but what do you do with beauty when all you have is people struggling to make it through the next day? So that's how the book came together, and that's how we put it together. I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's how the whole book came together.
When I finished your book, the question that I had, that sort of I ended with was, um, okay, we have this violence in the borderland, which is now becoming almost pan-Indian. But so, are we stuck with borders forever, or are in our lifetimes are we ever going to see a borderless world, or in this region, or are we stuck with borders for a very very long time in this part of the world?
I think a new world is already being born. Either we, yeah, a new world is already being born, a world that we seem to not recognize. Climate change has already consumed far more land. and which will continue to submerge more land. And as I say in the book, what border will you protect with a standing army when ocean is raised and swallowed half of it? Second, the world as it exists today cannot go on. The inequality, the violence, the injustice, the neoliberal logic. I think the Suez Canal, the boat being stuck is a good metaphor. We cannot continue living like this, which means that every time in human history, um, a moment comes when the feudal system could not go on. What happened? A violent revolution called the French Revolution happened, which made way for something else. I'm not saying it was better. It something happened. Violence gave way to something else. The Orange Revolution meant that monarchy had to give way to democracy. India itself has a long, rich history of resistance to any kind of feudal order. Of course, we do not know what kind of resistance would have emerged in India, given the feudal order then became into the transition from feudal to the colonial rule kind of changed the landscapes here, but that this world as we know cannot go. A good example for us to see is what happened in Rojava in Syria, where a bunch of women got together and said, we are going to create a very different kind of a world where everybody's equal. And they continue to rule and administer this place for a few years. And I think that's a rich place for us to learn. There are socialist collectives in Jackson, Mississippi, where Black socialists are saying, the capital is withdrawn. We are going to go create our own community. COVID saw mutual community aids where communities got together and said, the state is doing nothing. We are going to take care of each other. The Seattle violence saw the autonomous zone of Seattle being created where the police, what is all of this? This is all people militating against a system that is not working for them. And I think that is already there. And I think it's for us. What are the farmers' protests in India? What was NRCCA protests in India? These are protests that are saying that the system is not working. We need something better. That system is happening. What will happen in the future? I don't know. But that new world is already being birthed. The choice is whether you want to have a role in shaping it or you don't have a role in shaping it. And I don't know in my lifetime if we would find more, today is 200 days of Omar Khalid's incarceration. I hope before borders disappear, I hope Omar comes out. I hope those are also part of the politics, right? That people who fight for a certain idea have the right to fight for it without being incarcerated. So I don't know, but I think something that change has already started, and it will remake our world in our lifetimes. And I don't think we can actually right now see how profoundly different this world will be in the next 10 or 15 years.
Before we end this conversation, I'm just curious to ask you, what's next? Have you had your fill of Borderlands, or are there more Borderlands and more fences that you are interested in visiting in other continents? Maybe
I don't know. I don't know.
maybe a border.
I don't know. This book taught me that I could be a writer, and I had to write a book to tell myself that I can be a writer. And the role of a writer, the role of anyone who watches the social world, is to respond to this political moment. And this political moment, whether it is, I've lived outside of my home for almost 20 years now. New York is my home now, and around me, I see things that are not okay, that are unjust, that are not okay, that will affect my life. In my home, which for me, home is always India, will always be Madras, things are not okay there either. So I am responding to this political moment, and I think what I do next will be the same, to be responding to the moment one does. I know it sounds very insubstantial, but I think the next would be to make sense of this political moment that's awaiting us. And even if one has to be a footnote in history, then one has to be a decent footnote in history, and to be useful and helpful. to say and speak up when one can, to give away the money you have one can, um, to do something for the person next to you that you would want people to do for you. I think all of that is connected. So I don't know if it's going to be another Borderlands, but I'm definitely, it's been too long. I need to go back. I mean, I have to go back to Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria because these are places where I have friends. These are places where um, a lot of us have lost people. So I think that will always be there. But will it become a book? I don't know. So I don't know. I really don't know. Hopefully, I'll do something with it. Oh, the idea is that hopefully I will be useful and helpful. I think that is what comes next.
And I'm sure it'll be as interesting and stimulating as Midnight's Borders, a people's history of modern India. Thank you, Suchitra, for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you. It was very generous of you. Thank you. Really
Thank you.
appreciate
Yeah, me too. Bye.
it. Bye.